Hello and welcome to this short video about cultural diversity. Cultural diversity, what does it actually mean? It's culturally embedded variations within society. So it's the idea of difference or variations. Cultural difference. Well, culture involves several elements. Norms, social norms, rules about what is acceptable and unacceptable on a small scale, like not wearing your shoes into some places of worship, that's unacceptable. Values, beliefs about what's important, worthwhile, desirable. For example, it's considered desirable to be hygienic, to be modest, to have humility. So the idea of being before God in our most human form without trying to present a kind of false image or persona. Status, it's part of our culture. We have beliefs about what is important, about who should be important, about social positions like leaders, workers, managers, and roles. We have beliefs about the patterns of duties that people should carry out. People with more prestige are expected to have more duties, more responsibilities, but that gives them more power, more influence, and it gives them probably legitimates or makes acceptable their control over others, their ability to restrict freedoms, in informal control and formal control. So cultural difference is really about variations in norms, values, status and roles between groups and between individuals. We can have different types of cultural diversity. We can have intercultural diversity, which is between cultural groups. For example, the West, culture of the West versus the culture of the East, especially the idea of Islam. These kind of differences between cultural groups are often emphasized, especially in certain discourses or narratives or discussions in media and other sources. But we also have intra-cultural diversity, which is within. For example, within the South Asian community, and in fact, within the Muslim community, there are variations in terms of Sunnis, Shias and other groups where there are clear differences in norms of values, beliefs. For example, I was just watching a video about what young British Muslims think about the caliphate, and quite a diversity of views. Each individual had their own sense or their own truth in regards to the caliphate and ISIS. So those principles. So cultural differences can be found across society in terms of food, the different diet, dress codes, the different clothing expected of different groups like men and women in different cultures, language, dialect, use of vocabulary. The north-south divide is another division. That is between groups, geographical places and locations. There are several different views in terms of diversity. So the Functionalists, first of all, they believe in consensus and social order. They have this view of human nature which is Hobbesian. So firstly, consensus, a shared agreement over norms and values. Cultural diversity creates cultural conflict. They believe that society, a harmonious society, a society that is orderly, is desirable, because they believe that humans are naturally selfish they've got the capacity for morality, according to Durkheim. So in that sense, he had a homo duplex model of humanity, which was two-sided. So he had the Hobbesian view about selfishness, the idea that we, without society, we would be in a war of all against all, because every individual would be an enemy to every other individual to some degree. And so it's only society that creates fear, which essentially keeps people conforming to the rules and keeps people towing the line. But Durkheim adds the idea of the conscience, the collective conscience, the sense that people have a shared moral system, shared moral boundaries. So cultural diversity creates problems from a functionalist perspective, in the sense that there's the host and the immigrant. And the host group and the immigrant group are likely to have different cultures. This leads to cultural conflict, where people will behave in a way that doesn't fit with the other culture. This can lead to disagreement. It explains the gap in the pay between different ethnic groups. It may explain racism. And so, in this sense, integration is desirable. The functionalists argue there should be this two-way process of adaptation, where each group changes to some degree, but not one group, but both groups are able to adapt to each other and creating a new consensus. And this creates social change. Social change may be desirable because the kind of deviance of today may create and anticipate the morality of the future. And so Durkheim and other functionalists accept that deviance is normal. It may even be beneficial by creating change, by reinforcing the boundaries, what everyone agrees is wrong and right, but also by creating this clear consensus between human beings. There's also the concept, as well as integration, or integrationism, this belief system about the need and the inevitability of integration, where people will inevitably, over time, they're bound to become part of one culture because of competition in the economy and people trying to achieve a role in the workplace. There's also the idea of assimilation and the idea that people will become absorbed into the whole, and that this is necessary. And obviously this is one of the concerns that is today voiced when we discuss the control of different groups. For example, people who are seen as propagandizing Islam and Islamic beliefs have been controlled and put under curfew. And there's one case on the BBC, on YouTube, a BBC video about radicals, where a man has lost his passport and his citizenship and passport kind of taken away and controlled within British society. So he argues he's still a citizen, but he's lost his passport, so he doesn't have the freedom to move. So again, there's this sense that the government wants people to assimilate into British society, and that is a different view from what the functionalists are talking about with adaptation. And assimilationism may be more supported by the New Right. The New Right are concerned about a moral decay. So there's a sense that the morals are being lost. There's a loss of social control, that there's an inadequate socialisation, that children are not being adequately brought up by parents into a shared set of values which are positive and which enable them to integrate and be successful in society. This leads to crime and poverty. They partly blame the welfare state for allowing and enabling benefit dependency, where there are perverse incentives. There are the wrong rewards for immorality, for people choosing not to work. And so newspapers like the Daily Mail have supported this concern about immigration and a lack of integration and the need for assimilation. There are recent stories, recent case where Ofsted reported about schools in Birmingham where there is a narrow Islamic focus to these non-state schools, privately fee paid by parents, where there's misogyny and anti-Semitism in the teaching materials within schools, and also danger to the health of students. So again, there's this sense that there's a problem with cultural diversity creating conflict and creating segregation and a lack of consensus. There's even the idea of a black underclass, where because of a kind of culture shock, groups that are culturally deprived, that don't have the kind of norms and values to enable them to be successful, are less likely to succeed, and passing these values of apathy, helplessness, dependency, powerlessness to their children, so that their children don't take individual self-responsibility, but just blame society. And so you've got Marsden's concept of nanny state, where you've got the welfare system is too generous with the welfare benefits to the poor, and there's some sections of the poor who will choose to rely on the system instead of relying on themselves. This is partly based on a neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is about freedom of the individual. And the argument is that in our new society, since World War II, we've taken responsibility from the individual, and we've given responsibility to the state. We've placed blame or fault lies with the state now, and the society, the culture, the structure of society, which is capitalist, racist, sexist, class prejudiced, and so on. And so we can see this in the Muslim community in recent years. There's been this debate about Islamophobia and about Muslim victimhood. So those are two different views. Muslim victimhood is more likely to be supported by the new right. And there are members of within the Muslim community, such as Majid Nawaz, who talks about the need for a reformation of Islam and the need to take responsibility within the community for radicalization and extremist ideologies that serve to actually disadvantage Muslims rather than benefiting them. There's also Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who talks about the way in which, from a Somalian background, she experienced female genital mutilation at the age of 5. She has become a political activist. A director, Theo van Gogh, who was making a film based on a script she wrote, was murdered, and a death threat was against Ayaan Hirsi Ali was pinned to the body. And she argues that actually Muslims should stand up to Allah. So she's making a very controversial statement where she's saying that this idea of submission is enabling extremists to use the creed of submission to actually dominate and exploit other groups. So there's a range of views within that more liberal framework, where they're actually critical of some left-wingers and liberals for emphasising the disadvantage that groups have, like groups of Muslims, and for underplaying the problem of individuals not having enough freedom, partly due to benefit dependency, but also due to this kind of blame culture and the culture of entitlement, where instead of kind of challenging someone who's saying, I have free speech, so I should be enabled to introduce a caliphate where there is no free speech, which they argue is contradictory. Instead, we should be giving freedom to the individual who says, I am gay, or I have my own personal faith, or I have my own personal ambitions and way of life. So we've gone from functionalism, the idea of integration. We've got the new right who may support assimilation, and David Cameron's talked about Britishness and no longer wanting to be passively tolerant. The failure of multiculturalism has been discussed by a number of thinkers. The Marxists would talk about the way in which ethnic groups are divided because of racism, and that is a result of capitalism. Essentially, racism serves capitalism. Capitalism has produced racism to divide the working class. Castles and Kosack talk about the fragmentation of the working class due to race. The neo-Marxist view, Stuart Hall talked about policing the crisis in the 1970s, young black males being labelled as muggers, and he argues that it was a moral panic, a sense of anxiety and concern about the moral fabric of society being under threat because of the image of young black males in terms of their youth, their culture as young black males, and their masculinity. There was this sense of a kind of fear and a panic. And he argues this is just a panic, it's not a reality. He also argued the police were racist. The Macpherson report into the Stephen Lawrence murder, where a young black man was killed by white males and not properly investigated by the police, and the white males were not prosecuted, that was seen as a landmark case because it showed institutional racism. It was just everyday racism against ethnic minorities. The social action approach has influenced neo-Marxism. It looks at labelling and stereotyping and moral panics. And it would say that with cultural diversity, there's this story and this ideology of integration, but that in reality that's just a construction or a belief system. And they advocate people being active and not passive in forming an identity. So they would say that in reality, people are always constructing reality based on their definitions and meanings in their mind. And in that sense, we need to look at the way in which those with power, such as David Cameron, are actually labelling different groups to maintain control. This view has been criticised by Marxists who say it ignores the wider structure of capitalism in which these meanings and labels are applied. And that's why neo-Marxism was developed, to try and look at poverty of young black males, as well as the labels applied. There's also the idea of postmodernism, talking about anything goes, there's more choice and change in society. And so they advocate the idea of equality based on individual choices. So cultural diversity has been supported by Tariq Madood, who's talked about multiculturalism. And so there's a sense that we should not segregate, we should not integrate, we should celebrate together. So in other words, there's a sense of celebration of different cultures together, coexisting peacefully and harmoniously. So that view has been criticised as a failed project, with the evidence of segregation, the evidence of extremism at both sides in terms of white males who are racist, and terrorism and extremism in that form as well. The idea of multiculturalism has been criticised, and the idea is that segregation is now the reality. Trevor Phillips was chairman of the Equalities organisation in the UK, and he has been quoted as talking about the problem of segregation and white flight. And there is official national statistics from the government shows that 50% of ethnic minorities live in an area where whites are the minority. And that suggests that there's actually segregation rather than integration, and that these pockets of different groups and different communities, and they're polarising themselves. Although the evidence shows that it's whites moving out of city areas, whereas members of ethnic minority communities are happy to move into areas where there are other ethnic minority groups. It's actually whites who are moving out of those areas, and so that's white flight, creating ethnic segregation. So there are several views in terms of integration, assimilation, multiculturalism, and the concern that there's still segregation. If you have any questions about this, please email Daniel_Butcher@hotmail.co.uk.